"Don't look in that trunk," the Japanese woman told him on the night she arrived, and the rancher swore he wouldn't. For weeks she scrubbed his floors, mended his tack, and said almost nothing, while the whole town guessed at what a quiet woman from across the Pacific was running from. Then the locked lid started pulling at a proud man the way a sealed door always does, and one night he broke the only promise he'd made her. What he found inside rewrote everything he'd assumed about the woman sleeping under his roof. If you want to see what a cynical rancher does when the quiet housekeeper turns out to be carrying a samurai's secret, stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The supply buckboard rolled into Zane's yard just after sundown, its wheels grinding to a stop in the kind of silence that only falls on a ranch where the work has outlived the people doing it. 2 kerosene lanterns hung from the porch posts, throwing amber light that flickered across the dirt and made every shadow lean and unsteady. Zane stood in the doorway with his boots untied and his shirt half buttoned, watching the driver unload a woman small enough to disappear behind the single trunk they set down at her feet. He had asked the agency for a housekeeper, and the agency had sent him a stranger who looked like she weighed less than the saddle he'd meant to repair 3 months ago. Her hair was jet black and pinned in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her head, and she wore a plain kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat that had seen more miles than his favorite horse. Her face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, fair skin, and eyes so dark they looked black in the lantern light, and she held herself with the kind of stillness that only comes from having already accepted the worst a place can do to a person. She did not smile, and she did not flinch when he came down the steps. Absence of both told him more than any introduction could have. The town would call her only the Japanese woman, for the week was out, because a place like this had no other name ready for what stood in his yard. Zane had run the place alone since the fever took his wife 2 years back, and alone was a generous word for what he'd been doing, which was closer to watching it slowly come down around him. The fences sagged where the cattle had leaned on them. Through a winter he couldn't bring himself to ride the line. The tack hung in the barn gathering dust, because a man who fixes a bridle is a man who plans to ride tomorrow, and for a long time tomorrow hadn't felt like something he was ordering. He'd taken the housekeeper not because he wanted company, but because the agency's wage was cheaper than a foreman, and the silence in the kitchen had started to sound like a thing with teeth. He'd expected some sunburned woman with hard hands and nothing to say, the kind the territory produced in plenty, and what the buckboard had given him instead was a stranger who looked like she'd been carved out of a country he'd never see. The trunk was the size of a small coffin, bound in dark metal and locked with a brass hasp that had been shut so long the keyhole had gone green. She set her hand on its lid the way a mother sets a hand on a sleeping child, and Zane noticed that her fingers stayed there even while she bowed her head to him. "I work hard," she said, and her English was slow and careful and stripped of anything extra. "I cook, I clean, I mend, I earn my wage." He told her the wage and the hours, and the fact that the last housekeeper had quit because the place was too far from anything and too close to him. She listened without moving, and then she gave him the rule, the only condition she set before she would pick up a rag in his house. "The trunk stays closed. You do not open it. Not ever." He almost laughed, because a man who hadn't cared about much in 2 years wasn't about to care about a stranger's luggage. He swore to it, careless and quick, the way a man swears to things he never intends to test. She picked up the trunk as though it weighed nothing and carried it past him into the house, and the lock clicked behind her bedroom door before he'd finished tying his boots. That night he lay in his bed and listened to the wind push against the shutters, and he told himself the trunk meant nothing, that people who crossed an ocean were entitled to whatever privacy they could carry. But the rule had landed in him like a splinter, small and sharp and already working its way in, because a man who gives his word on a thing he doesn't understand has just agreed to carry a question he can't put down. She was up before him the next morning, and the coffee was hot, and the kitchen was clean, and the smell of rice and something savory had replaced the stale ghost of his own cooking. Zane came downstairs, limping on the leg he'd ruined 2 winters back, when a horse rolled on him in a creek bed, and he found her already washing the windows as though the ranch had been waiting for her its whole life. She did not look up when he sat down, and she did not fill the silence with the kind of chatter the last housekeeper had used to paper over his bad moods. She simply worked, and the work had a rhythm to it that made the quiet feel like part of the job. His leg had been giving him trouble for months, the old wound reopening every time the weather turned, and he'd been dosing it with whiskey because the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride, and he trusted doctors less than he trusted the average man. On the 3rd morning she set a lacquered medicine box on the table beside his coffee, opened it, and laid out a row of needles, so fine they caught no light at all, alongside small paper packets of herbs that smelled like a garden he had never stood in. He pressed a needle into his thigh before he could object, and the heat that followed was unlike anything the whiskey had ever given him, and he sat there watching his own face change in the reflection of the window because he didn't have the words for what she was doing. She did not name it. She did not explain that the knowledge came from her grandmother in Kyoto, or that the herbs were mixed the way they had been mixed for generations in her family. She simply let the cowboy's face do the explaining. The way the voice of this valley always let a man's reaction carry the meaning, his pride wouldn't let him speak. By the end of the week, his leg bore weight again, and he had stopped pouring the whiskey into the wound, and he hadn't thanked her because he did not yet know how the town was slower to come around. When he took her into the general store for supplies, the men on the porch watched her the way they watched weather that didn't belong to the season, and one of them asked Zane if she was Chinese, and another asked if she could even read a list. She shrank from being seen there, pulling the trail coat tight, but she never shrank from the work itself, and that distinction wasn't lost on a man who had spent his life measuring people by what they did when no one was watching. The storekeeper called her the Japanese, dropping the word like it was a brand and not a person, and Zane corrected him once and then let it go because some arguments cost more than they're worth. She handed the storekeeper her list without looking at the men leaning on the rail, and the list was written in a hand so precise it might have been printed, and the storekeeper held it upside down for a beat before he turned it right. Zane watched the porchmen watch her, and felt the familiar weight of a town that calls itself friendly the way a trap calls itself open, and he put a hand at the small of her back to steer her out of there before the guessing could turn to betting. She did not pull away from the hand, which surprised him, and she did not lean into it either, which didn't. On the ride back, she sat beside him on the buckboard seat with the trunk balanced behind them, and said nothing, and the nothing had a different texture than the nothing at the ranch, the difference between a chosen quiet and a quiet that has been forced on you. There was an evening, maybe 2 weeks in, when she cooked a meal he hadn't asked for and set it in front of him without a word. He ate it like a man who had forgotten that food could taste like something other than fuel, and she stood at the stove with her back to him, and for the first time since his wife died, the kitchen felt like a room instead of a chore. He did not say anything, and neither did she, and the not saying was the first real thing that had passed between them. The stranger rode in on a Sunday, dressed too well for the territory, with a clean hat and a horse that hadn't earned its dust on any ranch road. He asked his questions at the general store first and then at the livery, and by the time he turned up Zane's drive, the whole town knew a man was looking for a woman from across the Pacific. Zane met him on the porch with a rifle leaning against the door frame, not raised, but present, the way a man in this country signals that a conversation has a floor and a ceiling. The stranger produced a folded notice, not quite a warrant and not quite a poster describing a woman traveling alone and an article of value that had been taken from its rightful owners across the ocean. He never said the word samurai, and he never said the word sword, because men who hunt things for money learn to keep the shape of the prize out of their mouths. He said the woman, and he said the article, and he offered a price for information that was more than Zane made in a good year. Zane looked at the notice, and looked at the man, and lied to his face without rehearsing it, said he hadn't seen any Japanese woman, said the only strangers through here lately were cattle buyers and a preacher who got lost. He sent the stranger south toward a settlement that didn't exist anymore, and he did it with the same flat calm he used when he sold a horse he knew was lame, and the lie came out so easy it scared him a little. He had not lied to protect anyone in a long time, and he stood on the porch after the stranger rode away, trying to name what had made him do it for a woman he barely knew. He went inside and poured himself a coffee he didn't drink, and stood at the window where she had stood, and he tried the stranger's offer against the number in his head and found that the money hadn't moved him at all, which was the strangest part. A year ago he would have sold his own name for that kind of cash, and the fact that he hadn't even hesitated told him something had shifted in the house without his permission. He had spent 2 years deciding that nothing was worth the trouble of lying for, and now he had lied for free, for a woman whose last name he didn't know, and whose trunk he'd promised not to touch. Tsumugi was watching from the kitchen window, and he could see the moment she understood, because the stillness she carried like armor cracked open for the first time since she'd arrived. That night, he heard her move the trunk from beneath her cot to the space between the cot and the door. He heard the lock checked twice, and the sound of brass being tested in the dark was the sound of a woman preparing for the place she'd found to burn down around her. He understood, then, that her fear wasn't of being caught. Her fear was of the ranch catching fire because of her, of his barn and his fence lines, and his few remaining horses, paying for a secret she had carried across an ocean. Which made the stakes simple in a way he hated. Everything he had left was standing in the path of her past, and he had just bought it a little time with a lie he couldn't take back. The wall between them came down the way a fence comes down in a slow winter, one post at a time, so gradual that he didn't notice the gap until he was already walking through it. When the foreman came down with a fever that turned his skin the color of old candle wax, Zane sent a hand for the doctor and braced himself for the 2-day wait, and Tsumugi opened the lacquered box and went to work as though she had been waiting for exactly this. She brewed something bitter from the paper packets and pressed points along the foreman's arms with a steadiness that made the sick man stop shaking. And by morning the fever had broken and the doctor arrived to find a patient who no longer needed him. Zane asked her a real question that night, the first one that wasn't an order or a question about supplies. He asked where she'd learned it, and she answered with a single careful sentence about a grandmother and a garden and a house that wasn't there anymore, and the way she stopped herself mid-sentence told him the rest of the story was locked in the same place as the trunk. He did not push, because a man who has lost a house of his own learns to recognize the shape of a door someone has closed on purpose. There was a horse in the far pasture that no one could touch, a black mare that had rolled on a hand the previous spring and remembered it like a grudge, and Tsumugi walked out to her one morning while Zane watched from the fence. She did not raise her voice, and she did not raise a hand, and she stood with the mare for the better part of an hour, until the animal dropped its head and let her touch its neck. The geometry of how she held herself, feet set, and shoulders square, and one hand always free, wasn't the geometry of a servant. He filed it away the way he filed away anything that didn't fit, telling himself he'd make sense of it later, not yet understanding that later was coming faster than he thought. He started noticing meals she hadn't been asked to cook and mending she hadn't been assigned, and he started leaving things where she'd find them, a sack of the tea she favored, a length of cloth the right weight for a kimono, without ever saying they were for her. She noticed, and he knew, she noticed, and neither of them named it, because naming it would have required admitting that two people who had come to this ranch to be left alone were no longer here to be alone. One night, she almost told him something. He found her sitting on the porch steps with her hands folded in her lap, and the valley stretched out dark below them, and she started a sentence, and then closed her mouth on it, like a person biting down on a wound. He waited, and she didn't continue, and the unfinished sentence hung between them for the rest of the week. It was the closest she had come to trusting him, and the fact that she stopped herself told him that whatever was in the trunk was heavier than anything he had imagined, and that her silence wasn't deception, but the last wall a woman without a country had left to stand behind. He carried that unfinished sentence to bed with him, and it kept him awake longer than the wind ever did, because a man who has heard the first half of a confession knows that the second half is coming, whether he asks for it or not. He thought of the locked door down the hall, and the woman behind it, and the weight she carried to that cot every night, and he understood that patience was the only honest price for what she wasn't ready to give. So he waited, and the waiting was its own kind of promise, the kind that doesn't need a lock to hold. A ranch hand came back from town with the news that a clean-headed stranger had been through again, asking the same questions, and that he'd ridden north this time instead of south. The word north landed in Zane like a stone in a well, because north was where the trails converged, and where a patient man could sit and watch every road that led to this ranch. The stranger had corrected his course, which meant the lie had a shelf life, and it meant Tsumugi had brought something onto his land that was still actively hunting for her. The distrust that had always been his default setting turned over in him and pointed the other way, away from the stranger and toward the woman in his kitchen. He told himself he had a right to know what he was dying to protect, that a man couldn't defend a secret. He hadn't been told that the promise he'd made had been made blind, and blind promises don't count. He knew, even as he reasoned it, that he was building a case for the thing he already wanted to do, because the trunk had been pulling at him for weeks, and now he had something that felt like justification. He walked the house, like a man arguing against his own better nature, and the argument got stronger with every step, because pride is a clever lawyer when it wants something badly enough. He told himself that a woman who sleeps behind a locked door in a man's house owes that man the truth of what she's guarding, and he told himself that the stranger, riding north, made the truth a matter of survival rather than manners. Both of those things sounded reasonable in the morning light, and both of them were lies. He was telling to dress up the simple fact that he wanted to know. The wanting had been there since the night she arrived, and the stranger had only given it a reason to stop pretending it was anything else. She rode out to the far pasture early the next morning to check the black mare, and Zane stood in the hallway and looked at her closed bedroom door and felt the pull of it the way you feel a current before you see the water. He told himself he would just look, that looking wasn't the same as breaking a promise. And then he understood that looking was exactly the promise, and he went and got the pry bar anyway. The brass hasp cracked under the iron, with a sound like a small bone giving way, and the lid swung up into the amber wash of the kerosene lamp, and the smell that came up out of the trunk was cedar and oiled steel, and something older than either. The katana lay on top in a scabbard of worn black lacquer, the kind of blade a man doesn't carry for show, and beneath it a longer shape, wrapped in cloth that he didn't yet know was a naginata. There was a letter, folded in careful brush strokes he couldn't read, and a small portrait of a man in formal robes, with the same high cheekbones as the woman who scrubbed his floors. He stood there, with the pry bar in his hand and the rule broken, and the truth of her sitting in the lamplight, and the truth wasn't what he'd feared, and wasn't what he'd guessed. She wasn't running from shame. She was the daughter of a samurai who had refused to surrender his blades when the emperor's edict came down and made a sword a crime, and the government men who destroyed her father had spent years trying to erase the last proof that he had ever stood against them. The katana was that proof, the one thing her father had kept when keeping it cost him everything, and the locked trunk hadn't been a lie, but the only boundary a woman with a price on her name had left to call her own. He had broken his word to a woman whose entire life had been built on the chance that one stranger would keep his, and the realization sat on him heavier than the blade itself, because he understood now that the trunk had never been about hiding something from him. It had been about finding out whether he was the kind of man who could be trusted with a thing that mattered, and he had just answered that question in the worst possible way. She came back from the pasture and read the scene in a single glance. The lid ajar, and the pry bar on the floor, and the air in the room changed the way air changes after a door has been forced. She did not beg, and she did not raise her voice, and she set the bag of feed she was carrying down by the wall as though she were already beginning to pack. He had expected anger, or tears, or the quiet devastation of a woman whose last wall had been kicked in, and instead he got the calm of someone who had always known the wall would come down and had been ready for it before she ever knocked on his door. You opened it. It wasn't a question, and she didn't wait for him to pretend it was. End quote. She looked at the blade and the letter, and the portrait laid out in the lamplight, and then she looked at him, and her eyes were the eyes of a woman measuring whether the man in front of her was worth the trouble of explaining herself to one more time. He asked her why she hadn't told him, and the hurt in his voice was the hurt of a man whose word was the only thing he'd thought he had left to give, and she had made him spend it on a secret she could have handed him for free. She answered him with one line that turned the whole story over in his hands, said that she had made him swear because a promise given was the only thing she could trust a stranger with, and that he had kept it right up until the moment he didn't. The logic of it was the logic of two honor codes that had nothing in common except the thing they both demanded of a person, and he heard it land in himself before he understood it in words. He thought about the oath he'd given her on the porch that first night, and the oath her father had given the emperor's men when they came for the blade, and how different the words were and how identical the cost. A cowboy's word and a samurai's word turned out to be the same currency struck in different metal, and the exchange rate between them was a thing neither of them would ever need to calculate. He had spent his life trusting men who talked like him and doubting everyone else. And the woman on the floor in front of him was the first person in years who had made him doubt the reach of that map. She told him the rest, then because there was nothing left to guard. The men who were coming weren't lawmen, and never had been, but hirelings of the faction that had ruined her father, sent to collect the blade as proof that the last thread of his defiance was cut, and to collect her as the last witness to any of it. She unwrapped the cloth from the longer shape in the trunk, and showed him the naginata, polearm with the curved blade that the women of her family had carried for generations. She told him that she had trained with it since she was old enough to hold it upright in a garden that didn't exist anymore. He had not expected that. He had expected a victim, and instead, he was looking at a woman who had been armed her whole life and who had chosen to clean his floors, not because she was helpless, but because she had been waiting to find out whether the floors were worth defending. The katana in the trunk was her father's honor, and would stay her father's honor, But the weapon that was hers, the one she meant to use when the men rode back, was the naginata now resting across her knees. She looked at the broken lock, and then at him, and she asked the only question that mattered anymore, which was whether the man who had broken his word once would stand beside the woman he'd broken it against. Zane picked up the pry bar and put it back on the shelf, and the putting back was its own kind of answer, the kind this valley understood better than any speech." End quote. They came up the drive 3 mornings later in a column of dust, 3 riders with the clean-hatted stranger in the lead. The size of them was the first thing Zane measured, because size was how a man in this country counted the cost of a fight before it started. The stranger had brought 2 others this time, hard men, who sat their horses the way men sit them, when they've been paid to finish a job, and the 3 of them together could burn a ranch like Zane's before noon, and be 2 territories away by dark. Zane had seen 3-on-1 before, in a mining camp, and once outside a courthouse, and he knew the arithmetic well enough to know it didn't favor the one. He also knew that arithmetic only counts the bodies in the yard, and not the reason they're fighting, and a man who fights for wages quits when the wages run out, while a man who fights for a floor he's standing on doesn't quit at all. He had a rifle with 6 rounds, and a shoulder that was finally whole, and a woman in the house who had asked him one question and gotten an answer in the putting back of a pry bar, and he meant to make that answer worth something before the dust settled. Zane walked out to meet them with the rifle across his body, and he placed himself between the riders and the door, the way a man places a stone in a creek when he wants the water to go around. The stranger smiled, the way men smile when they believe the paperwork in their pocket is heavier than the iron in yours, and he held up the folded notice and said, "The woman and the article, just like before, only now there was no pretense of asking nicely." "She's mine," Zane said. The words came out of him plain and final, the single protective claim that this valley had used for 100 years to turn a stranger into family in a space of a breath. "The ranch is mine. The blade is mine, because she's mine, and there's no paper from the other side of the ocean that gives you authority on my ground." The stranger's smile thinned, because a claim like that isn't a legal argument, it's a line drawn in dirt, and crossing it costs a man something he can't get back. One of the hard men reached for his holster, and Zane fired into the dirt at the horse's feet, and the animal spun, and the yard erupted into the kind of chaos that has no front and no back. Chumugi was already moving. She came out the side door with the naginata low and balanced, the long curved blade catching the morning light. She did not run, and she did not shout, and she moved across the yard with the measured pace of a woman who had been taught that a polearm wins by reach and patience, and never by haste. The second rider turned his horse toward her, and she let him come. And the geometry her grandmother had drilled into her in a Kyoto garden unfolded now in a Wyoming yard, feet set and blade rising, and the horse's chest meeting steel at exactly the distance she had chosen. The fight turned wrong fast, the way fights do when 3 rifles are aimed at one man on a porch. A shot caught Zane high in the shoulder and spun him into the door frame, and the rifle clattered down the steps, and the stranger kicked it away and put his own barrel on Zane's chest. The ranch was seconds from being taken, the kind of seconds that stretch longer than they should, and Tsumugi saw the man she had decided to stand beside, about to die on his own porch for a promise he'd already broken once. She closes the distance before the stranger can settle his weight on the trigger, and the naginata sweeps low and takes the rifle out of his hands and sends it spinning into the dust. The man stares at the empty space where the gun was, and then up at the woman holding 6 feet of steel over him, and his face does the math faster than his pride can stop it. He is too late. He had come for a quiet housekeeper and a stolen heirloom, and the quiet housekeeper is standing over him with the weapon of a woman who was never prey. The third rider comes at her from the side, and she pivots the way she was taught, the long blade catching the horse across the flank and sending it sideways, and the man goes down hard into the yard and stays down. The stranger scrambles for his revolver, and Zane, bleeding against the doorframe, does the thing that costs him the last of what he had been hoarding, which is to get back up. He picks up the fallen rifle with his good arm and puts it on the stranger from across the yard, and the two of them, the rancher and the woman with the polearm, hold the man between them like a sentence waiting to be finished. The stranger tries to speak, and Tsumugi lets the blade rest against his throat, the edge just touching the skin, and she tells him in her slow, careful English that the blade he came for stays where it is, and the woman he came for is not leaving. She tells him to walk his men off this ranch and never come back up this drive, and she tells him that if any of them return, the blade will not stop at the throat. The man walks his horse backward, off the property with his hands open, and his pride in pieces, and the third rider limps after him, and the yard goes quiet, in the way a yard goes quiet after the sound of guns has finally stopped. Meaning anything. Zane sits down on the porch step, presses his hand to his shoulder, and the blood comes through his fingers, dark and slow, and Tsumugi is beside him in a moment with the lacquered box already open. She presses a needle into the place above the wound and packs herbs against it, and her hands are steady, even though her breath isn't, and he watches her work and understands for the first time that she has been saving things all along, him included, in the order they mattered. He let her work, and he let the quiet hold, and for the first time since the fever he sat in his own yard, without feeling like a man occupying a house that belonged to a ghost. The foreman would live, and the black mare was already standing again at the far fence, and the barn door could be hung new by sundown, and the things that were broken were the kind that broke outward and left the core standing. She had come to this ranch to disappear, and instead she had shown him what was still worth keeping in it, and the showing had cost her the one secret she had carried across an ocean to protect. One hunter is broken in the yard, and one fled down the drive, and the leader riding out, with the understanding settling on him too late that the quiet woman was the whole war and never the prize. The barn door hangs splintered where a horse went through it, and there's blood in the dirt, and the morning has the taste of smoke and iron, and there's nothing clean about any of it. Winning for people like these was never going to be the kind of thing that felt like winning, and the both of them know it as they sit on the step and let the quiet come back into the valley, one sound at a time. Morning came up slow and gold over the ridge, and the trunk stood open in the kitchen, with the katana laid across its cloth, and the letter beside it, and nothing left to guard. Tsumugi sat across from Zane, with the bandage fresh on his shoulder, and the portrait of her father between them on the table, and for the first time she read the letter aloud in her own words, instead of letting the brushstrokes keep their silence. It was a samurai's last instruction to his daughter, written before the men came for him, telling her to carry the blade until she found a place where honor could live without a price hanging over it. She had crossed an ocean looking for that place, and she had scrubbed floors in a stranger's house, because scrubbing floors was the shape keeping her head down took, and the locked trunk had been the last piece of her father she could still protect. Zane listened to the letter and understood that the promise he'd broken had been the test, the one a man like her father would have set before he trusted anyone with the blade, and that failing it was the thing that finally made her sure of him. A man who will break his own word to know the truth, she told him, is the kind of man who will keep it once the truth is known, and she had needed to learn which one he was before she could lay the blade down. He asked her what she meant to do with the katana now, and she set her hand on the scabbard, the way she had set it on the lid the night she arrived. She said it would stay in the house, not hidden, but not for sale, not a secret, but not a trophy. He thought about the storekeeper and the men on the rail and the way they would look at her the next time she rode in. Some of them would see her differently now, and most of them wouldn't, and neither would change the fact that she would ride in anyway. A woman who had crossed an ocean with a blade and a letter and a locked trunk wasn't going to be unmade by a porch full of guessing, and he found, watching her, set the naginata by the door, that he had stopped wanting to be unmade by it himself. The naginata she leaned by the kitchen door where the broom had been in easy reach, and the geometry of the room rearranged itself around it the way a room rearranges itself around a thing that belongs there. Two codes that looked nothing alike had asked the same thing of the two people in that kitchen, and the morning light came in through the clean windows she had washed, and lay across both of them equally. The town would still call her the Japanese woman, and the storekeeper would still drop the word like a brand, and Zane knew he would correct him more than once before the habit took. But on the ranch, she had a name, the name the viewer has known all along, and he used it now, Tsumugi. When he asked her if she would stay, the using of it was the smallest and the largest thing he had done in 2 years. He said yes, the way she said everything, plain and without extra, and the yes landed in the quiet kitchen like the last board of a fence finally set in place. Another stranger will ride up this drive, eventually, because a valley like this always does. The question that stays is, what honor costs when the only witnesses left are two people who already know? Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and if it earned its place in your evening, I'll bring you the next one that rides in off the trail.